Before life became a blur of schedules and deadlines, architecture was my refuge. Designing wasn't just a job. It was my foundation, my way to turn visions into reality. Each project was a piece of me, carefully crafted. But as the hours piled up, a gap grew between me and the ones I loved most, Judy and our twin daughters. Despite my passion, I realized I was getting too immersed in my work. Judy had always been my anchor. We fell in love when everything seemed possible, dreaming of a life we'd build together. She brought balance to my late nights, but over time, our hectic schedules started pulling us in different directions. Without realizing it, we began filling the growing distance in our own ways. Tonight, as I lay on our bed in a haze of excitement, I was jolted by the sound of the garage door. "No way," I muttered, glancing at the clock. 10:45. She shouldn't be home yet. The room was prepped for a romantic evening. Rose petals, champagne. But now, in seconds, my careful plans felt like they were slipping away. It had been a tough year since I'd gone solo. My office was an old gas station, and with only one client, I was working nonstop. I tried working from home, but found myself taking breaks to spend time with Judy and the girls. The girls had been a surprise, arriving just before I graduated. And while we wanted a big family, complications from the birth had made it impossible. We'd tried fertility treatments, but expenses kept us from going all in until now. Judy had returned to work to help make ends meet, landing a job with flexible hours that seemed ideal. But Fridays were different. She had to fly to Dallas for her boss's meetings, meaning she rarely got home before 11 p.m. 4 months ago. Her boss's promotion extended those Fridays even longer. I wasn't thrilled, but since Judy didn't complain, I stayed silent. Tonight was meant for celebration and romance, but now it felt like everything was unraveling. I'd planned it all down to the minute, from the rose petals to her favorite dessert. I'd even checked her flight status to make sure everything was timed perfectly for her arrival. This evening was special. Today, I learned the first house I'd designed won a prestigious architecture award. I wanted to tell Judy alone and start a romantic weekend together, celebrating before diving back into the complexities of fertility treatments. With the extra business this award might bring, we could finally afford the best care. Our daughters were off with my parents, so the stage was set. But now, hearing her pull into the garage, doubt started creeping in. Could she really be home this early? My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask, yet couldn't ignore, since she started coming home on late Friday flights. Judy's new habit of going straight to the hot tub has become routine. Without changing into a swimsuit, she'd simply slip in wearing just her bra and lingerie, calling it Mama's come-down time. I was sure it was a clever pun. Judy always had a knack for that. Now, when Judy arrives home from these late flights, we no longer make love like we used to on Fridays. The extra hours at work leave her too exhausted. Before these flights, just a couple of hours earlier, she'd come home energized and practically leap into my arms. It used to surprise me. She'd rarely initiated things before, but for that month, she'd barely wait until the kids were in bed. Then, after the late flights started, that all stopped. Judy remained receptive when I initiated things, just never on Fridays. Of course, an 18-hour day could make anyone exhausted, but her chatter about work had also changed, and so had our social life. At first, we often attended small gatherings with her colleagues, and she'd talk endlessly about her wonderful boss. I'd get jealous hearing about his savvy business skills or when she'd go on about how much he looked like a young Sean Connery. But 3 or 4 months ago, all that talk stopped, as did the gatherings. I remember feeling relieved, though now I suspected something darker. Then came the realization that truly shook me. I couldn't remember the last time she told me she loved me, gave me one of those sweet pecks on the cheek, or even a spontaneous hug. Judy, who had always been affectionate, now seemed distant, at least with me. I froze, denying the thought that Judy, my Judy, the only woman I'd ever loved, might have been in someone else's arms. The mental image was unbearable. Then I heard her voice. "Matt, where are you? I'm so glad to be home." Her familiar tone didn't match the picture in my mind. I shook my head. This couldn't be happening. Maybe I misread the flight schedule or her plane had made up some time. In 3 steps, I was at the computer in our room, refreshing the page. There it was. Her flight was still half an hour away from landing. I looked back at our rumpled bed, realizing I needed to know the truth. As I rushed downstairs, a low, involuntary sound escaped from my throat. When I reached the deck, Judy had already taken off her blouse and was unzipping her slacks. I moved in behind her, holding her tightly. "Matt, please, I'm exhausted. Just let me relax till tomorrow." She squirmed as I reached for her, becoming increasingly frantic until she wriggled free, screaming, I said no! She stood, panting and staring at me with a look that stopped me in my tracks. No, Matt, not this way. I won't let you find out this way. Those words hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I felt nothing, just a hollow calm. I knew my world was shattered, yet I couldn't feel a thing. In an eerie voice, I heard myself ask, "You wouldn't do this to us unless you loved him. Did you ever love me?" Her face softened. "I did love you. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted it to get this far. I'll always—" I interrupted, unwilling to hear more. "Are you going to marry him?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "It's come up. He's been urging me to decide, but I'm so confused." I cut her off again. "Please go back to his place. I only just figured all this out because your flight hasn't even landed yet. I need time alone to process this." Judy stepped closer, her face filled with regret. "Matt, I'm so sorry. I wish it hadn't come to this. Please, let me explain." I stepped back, feeling as fragile as if I were made of fine crystal, knowing that even the lightest touch from her would shatter me beyond repair. I extended my hand, signaling her to stop. "Please, just take what you need, and go." Mom and Dad took the girls on one of their outings, and they'll be unreachable until Sunday evening. Let's talk Sunday afternoon. I don't want to see or hear from you until then. My body trembled, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered if it was rage, fear, or even a heart attack. She looked at me with pleading eyes, as if about to say something, but I cut her off with a firm no. For a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes before she sighed and headed to our bedroom. The numbness washed over me again. I sank heavily into the recliner in the den, wondering how long the emptiness in my mind would last. I lost track of time before she came back. Her face looked wistful, with a hint of sorrow, reminding me of her expression when she learned she couldn't have another child. "Matt, I saw what you had planned. I didn't mean to ruin it. If you want—" Her words hit me like a thunderclap. How could she? She was offering pity and intimacy on her terms. I began to get out of my chair, and when she saw my expression, she sobbed and ran from the room. I heard her car sit in the garage for a while before the door finally opened and shut. Once the garage door thudded closed, I slumped back in my chair, and the colorless void overtook me again. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind empty before sleep claimed me. I woke in a rage from a vivid dream of Judy making love to her boss. It wasn't wild or illicit, but gentle and full of tenderness. My body ached as I rose, every joint protesting, yet I was burning with a new, unfamiliar anger. I stormed back to our bedroom, though there could be no more us. In a furious haze, I grabbed the champagne bottle from the cooler and smashed everything breakable in sight until I stood over a delicate Dresden figurine of a young woman in a pale blue ball gown, holding a fawn, Judy's only inheritance from her grandmother. Though I wanted to destroy it, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Looking around the wrecked room, I felt no relief. I looked at the champagne bottle in my hand, amazed it hadn't broken. Without thinking, I tore off the foil, untied the cork, and popped it open. The bubbly sprayed out just like in the movies. I wasn't much of a wine enthusiast, but years ago, I'd read about the Rothschild family and promised myself that if I ever made it big, I'd celebrate with a Chateau Lafite Rothschild Pauillac. Drinking directly from the heavy bottle, I vowed never to touch the stuff again. It tasted terrible. It didn't help me sleep either, but exhaustion eventually overtook me and I drifted off, thankfully dreamless. I woke a few hours later as the first light crept through the window. The rage had faded, leaving only numbness. I felt hollow inside. I tried to summon some emotion, anger, sadness, but felt nothing. I knew my marriage was over, but my mind refused to accept it fully, instead searching for memories of the past. I met Judy while attending the University of Texas. She was at Southwestern University in Georgetown and played on their Division III soccer team. I played club soccer at UT and had organized a team to compete in a 7-a-side tournament on SU's fields. Judy had come to watch, and I was instantly drawn to her. In my attempt to impress, I made a complete fool of myself, and our team didn't even advance, despite winning the tournament the year before and again the following year. Judy, kind as she was, pretended not to notice. From that day on, we were inseparable, driving the 26.8 miles up and down I-35 so often we could have filled a fuel reserve. But it didn't matter. She was a maid when we met. I'd had one high school girlfriend, and back then, I counted every moment we shared intimately. But with Judy, I lost count that first weekend at the Four Seasons after her sorority's spring formal. The funny thing was, we didn't make love that first night. As we undressed, Judy panicked, saying she couldn't, not without a real commitment. Without clothes, I knelt and proposed to her right then. Standing there in her bra and clutching the sheet, she accepted, though she still wanted a ring. I slept on the floor that night. The next morning we went to America's Diamond as soon as they opened, and I bought a ring I hoped she'd always be proud of. Back at the hotel, we exchanged private vows before God as I slid the ring on her finger. As we kissed, she guided me to the bed, her breath deepening as I touched her under her blouse. My hand moved to her thigh and slid under her skirt, feeling her respond with warmth. She hesitated briefly, then opened up to me, pulling me closer as we moved in sync, anticipation building between us. Moving with her growing warmth, I carefully slid a finger inside, feeling her tense before easing into her comfort. She gave me a shy smile, pulling me closer. Realizing her reluctance as I started to remove her lingerie, I paused, and she asked me not to look. I nodded, understanding her vulnerability, and gently suggested we move under the sheets. She looked relieved and, after a little encouragement, took off her blouse, hesitating. "I know I'm small," she started. "Sweetheart," I replied softly, liking the sound of that word. "You're perfect exactly as you are." She blushed with pleasure, letting her bra slip off, and pulled me to her. With a gentle smile, she opened herself to me, and I whispered that I loved her. As I moved forward, feeling her body adjust, I couldn't hold back and finish sooner than I wanted. Embarrassed, I tried to stay composed, but couldn't. Her expression was curious, and I apologized, saying I'd just been too excited. She kindly reassured me, saying, "We've got a lifetime to get this right, and practice makes perfect." Ready to try again? Though I wanted to, I admitted I'd need more time and mentioned I'd have to pick up more supplies, smiling at the thought of all the future moments we'd share. We married the following Christmas, settled in Round Rock, and finished school together. Throughout our marriage, I'd always felt confident she enjoyed our intimate life, and I took care to make sure she was happy in our family life. I adored her, and even brought a grass plug from her college soccer field to plant in our yard as a symbol of our love. I couldn't find any reason in our past for her actions. Sipping tea in numb silence, I felt no real emotions, even anger, though I realized our marriage was over when I discovered her infidelity. The day before, in a moment of rage, I destroyed her clothes, slashing through everything without fully realizing it. A chilling reminder of a painful childhood memory. I redirected my focus to her affair with her boss, James Capote. Despite their relationship, I felt no pain thinking of her with him. I was certain I could win her back if I wanted, given her guilt, our children, and my understanding of her. Yet, I disliked Capote from the start. He'd been divorced with limited custody of his children. And though I could see why he'd pursued Judy, I found it hard to believe she reciprocated. Refusing to linger on what went wrong, I began researching Texas divorce laws, discovering it could be finalized in as little as 60 days if uncontested. I printed the necessary forms, focusing on securing a fair outcome for our daughters. Although tempted to cancel our credit cards and empty our accounts, I decided to trust that Judy wouldn't act against our family's interests. I wanted to keep the house so the girls wouldn't have to move. We'd borrowed heavily to start my business, leaving only a little equity. But with the upcoming prize, I could buy Judy out. I didn't want her or Capote to have any claim on it, so I needed a quick settlement. The prize announcement would be in 3 months, and although the winners were usually notified in advance, it wasn't yet public. With that, I knew it was important to finalize things soon and fairly. Balancing my emotions, I planned to have an appraiser assess everything, including the items I'd damaged, and offer to buy replacement items as part of the settlement. I focused on dividing our property in a way that would be fair and secure stability for the girls. That night, though I couldn't eat, I knew I'd need strength, so I ordered pizza and worked through the details of our separation. Though I knew I still loved Judy, her choice to be with Capote ended things. I considered if I could leverage her tendency to defer to my wishes to influence her choices, knowing I could exert subtle pressure. Deep into the night, I carefully planned my next steps. Around 8, Judy called. I composed myself before answering, reminding her that her choices had ended our marriage and that we needed to consider the girls. I asked if she wanted a peaceful separation or a battle. She tried to explain, saying she didn't want to hurt me and didn't want me to hate her. But I cut her off, expressing my anger at her betrayal. I reminded her of the impact on our daughters, stressing how important it was to approach this responsibly. I told her we should break the news to the girls together, but warned her not to reach out to me afterward, except about the children. I offered to pay for an apartment, but suggested she not live with Capote, unless they married, for the girls' sake. After a tense silence, she asked if she could come over to talk, but I firmly refused. Finally, I urged her to marry him, partly for the girls and partly for my own closure, so I wouldn't feel that our marriage ended for a fleeting affair. After a pause, she agreed to do things my way. If there's a hell, I've been there. I stayed detached, or I don't think I could have handled the pain on my daughter's faces when Judy began the, "You need to know your daddy and I love you very much, but sometimes adults make mistakes" speech. She talked in ways the girls couldn't understand, so I finally said gently, "Your mommy has fallen in love with someone else and wants to marry him, so we'll need a divorce." Instantly, I regretted saying it. As I held my daughters, their faces frozen in pain, I remembered a friend whose father liquidated his mother and himself in front of his kids, leaving them in an endless custody battle. At that moment, I understood the despair he must have felt. It took everything in me to resist a violent response. I'd never known such hatred as I did watching the hurt in my girls' eyes. I barely heard anything else as Judy spoke, until one of the girls asked, "But Mommy, why don't you love Daddy anymore?" Judy looked broken, but managed to say, "Mommy still loves Daddy. She always will." I added, "Mommy had to choose, and she chose him. Sometimes people can love more than one person, but they can only be married to one. Mommy needs to be married to Mr. Capote, but we'll work to make this as easy as possible for you." Suddenly, Carrie lunged at her mother, hitting her as hard as she could. Lori joined, swinging a brass kaleidoscope and cutting Judy's forehead. I pulled Lori back, but didn't comfort Judy. Coldly, I told her, "You've upset them. I think you'd better go. I'll tell the captain when you can pick up your things." Judy, bleeding, went to the kitchen for ice. When she returned, I held our daughters close as they cried. As she began to speak, I interrupted bluntly, asking if she'd be staying with the captain or if she wanted the girls to only call her cell phone. Calm, but clearly hurt, she replied that yes, she'd been staying with him for the past 2 nights and had hoped we'd talk to him together. I then told the girls to go to their room, explaining that their mother and I needed a moment alone. Once they left, I told Judy that the captain deserved to hear the news from her directly, and that she'd likely want to start planning the wedding. I handed her a packet of legal documents I'd prepared, explaining that it outlined my plan for dividing our assets. I added that I was open to terms, except for the girls' custody and her continued use of my last name. If she married Capote right after the divorce, I said I'd reconsider on the name to help shield the girls from the situation. I told her I wanted it over as soon as possible, 60 days from Monday. Taking a deep breath, I admitted that I had lost control earlier, but if she agreed, we could meet with the lawyer in the morning to settle everything and have the papers filed by nightfall. I added that if she was willing, I'd do all I could to support her relationship with the girls, promising that I'd never tell them, the captain, or anyone else that she had broken up our family. Judy seemed like she wanted to interrupt, but her tears finally started to fall, and she quietly turned and left the room. After putting the girls to bed, I sank into my chair, buried my head in my hands, and whispered, feeling a pang of regret, "The captain? This is going to crush him. He doesn't deserve this." Judy's father, though a retired admiral, never used the title since he hadn't served in that rank. A landing accident during his last command left him paralyzed, and despite his disability, he'd raised Judy on his own after her mother passed. He was like a second father to me, filling a space my own father, often absent for work, couldn't. The captain had a unique strength, even in a wheelchair, that had deeply influenced me. I always thought I could never leave Judy unless the captain did too. Taking a deep breath, I glanced at the clock, half convinced it was too late to call. He answered on the second ring. "Son, I'm on your side. She's my daughter, and I love her, but I can't believe she'd do something this reckless. I know she's confused, but..." He then shared stories of similar struggles in the Navy, wives straying during long deployments. Without saying it directly, he implied that some of those couples had found a way back. I respected him too much to interrupt. Finally, he asked, "I've read your papers. If I could knock some sense into her, would you consider another chance?" I had to smile, knowing the captain's way with words. We'd often debated the pros and cons of discipline with our kids, both believing gentle correction was better than trying to reason with a young mind, but neither very good at it. Then a coldness settled in my chest, and I worried for a moment if it was more than emotional pain. "No, sir. Captain, I'm sorry, but this wasn't a one-time mistake. I never understood how someone could feel like eliminating their spouse, but I do now. I'll spend my life working on forgiveness, but even if I couldn't live with her." I sighed, feeling the finality in my words, especially saying them to the captain. "Besides, sir, she loves him. I couldn't live with that, not even for the girl's sake. The captain's voice softened. Son, she's pretty mixed up right now. Maybe if you give it some time. She told me they'd been talking about marriage before I even knew. I know I was busy with work, but I can't just excuse this. I want her to marry him, and we'll both live with it. I won't speak poorly of her. Captain, our marriage is over, but I don't want the twins to think their mother ruined it for a fling. There was a long pause before the captain asked, Are you certain this is what you want? To push her into marriage with him? I steadied my voice. Judy and I will always be tied together through the twins, but right now I have no respect for her. If she marries him, at least she's doing the honorable thing. Maybe in a few years we'll see this differently, the captain interrupted. If she marries him, it's going to be rough, and it could affect our relationship too. You'll always be the girl's granddad, and I'll always be their father. I'll leave the rest up to you, but I'll never step back from what you and I have. The captain sighed. It's harsh, but we'll go with your plan. She's made her bed, so we'll see if she likes it. But remember, 2 wrongs don't make a right. I've lost count of how many times I've heard the phrase hard heart. Throughout the conversation, I could feel mine changing. I didn't hear a voice in my head, but I knew I was crossing a line, hardening my heart like steel. I understand, sir, but I have no choice. I couldn't take her back and still respect myself. No matter how much I love Judy, I won't be a weak husband. Even if I were willing, what kind of example would that be for my girls? Judy ended our marriage, and the sooner it's made official, the sooner we can move forward. If I hadn't known the captain so well, I might have still thought he was holding back tears when he replied, Son, I'm going to encourage her to accept your terms, to settle this tomorrow. Just promise me that you won't shut me out no matter how hard things get. Please, promise me. His voice faltered. My own voice was rough when I replied, You have my word, sir. There was a long, heavy silence, and I heard him murmur something that might have been goodbye. I didn't trust myself to even echo the word. I knew his pain must be greater than mine, caught as he was between us both. I hung up the phone, and though I tried, no tears would come. I hated what I'd become, and I hated Judy for leading me here. 3 months later, I sat alone at a table near the back of the large auditorium. When I walked forward to accept the prize, they announced I was the youngest person ever to win it. At 28, I was 7 years younger than the previous record holder. I gave an acceptance speech, trying hard to hide the hollow feeling inside. It was impossible not to think back to the days right after I'd learned I'd won. The captain had come to the lawyer's office that Monday morning, and each time Judy hesitated on a term, he firmly convinced her to accept a fair compromise. We wrapped everything up by noon, and the papers were filed at the courthouse by the end of the day. 61 days later, a judge finalized our divorce, and just a week after that, Judy became Mrs. James Capote. It hurt, and the girls cried through her entire honeymoon. Flying home, I realized just what I'd lost. I was now the hottest architect in the field, with clients lining up to hire me. But there I was, alone on a plane. I had my girls and my parents, but despite my success, I had no one to share the victory with. When I got home, my service was flooded with calls from eager clients, but I only picked up one, the captain's. He said all the right things to lift my spirits and let me know how proud he was. Then, in a gentle voice, he asked, When did you find out about it? When I told him, he cursed, like only a former Navy man can. After calming down, he said, That's tough. Really tough. Then, in a softer tone, he added, I know what it feels like to have life knock you down. Words may not help, but I'm here for you. After a pause, he offered, Son, I can't make it better, but if you want to go out and kick up your heels, I'll either watch the girls or join you and cover the tab. Thanks, Captain. As long as we don't talk about her, I can't think of anyone I'd rather go out with tonight. I went out with the captain that night, but that week remained one of the loneliest of my life. 2 years after the divorce, once again, I found myself in New York, celebrating another professional victory. This year's banquet added a 4th Frank Lloyd Wright Prize to my name. I'd won in the home category last year, and again this year, making an unprecedented three-peat. My 4th prize was for a commercial building I designed for the city of Midland, a project that had the architecture world buzzing. I'd also made history by winning in 2 different categories in the same year. Yet here I was, sitting alone at a table, surrounded by strangers, feeling more isolated than ever. Why was I so lonely? It wasn't due to lack of contact. Calls from potential clients worldwide flooded in so often that I'd had to get an unlisted home number. I traveled more than I wanted, but when I was home, I was fully present. I'd built an office addition to my house and rarely went downtown unless necessary. While home, I spent all my free time with the girls, and our summers were filled with adventures, some involving project sites, but mostly exploring the surrounding areas. I wanted my designs to reflect harmony with each unique environment. Nor was I lonely for lack of female attention. I hadn't dated much, but women from all over reached out, wanting to meet. My broken heart story had been picked up nationally, and it seemed many women were eager to mend it. It probably didn't hurt that I was making money faster than I could count it. But the truth was, I didn't like myself, not even a little. Until I learned to, I couldn't imagine loving or being loved by someone else. I wasn't celibate. I'd had opportunities for casual relationships, but I hadn't found anyone I wanted to truly connect with. I couldn't see much value in anyone who would want someone like me. Rather than face my own shortcomings, I blamed it all on trust. I told myself I couldn't trust anyone enough to bring them home to the twins, not until I was certain of a lasting commitment. Divorce, honestly, was miserable. While I managed to cope as an adult, it hurt deeply to watch the impact on my daughters. They never spoke directly about their mother, but I'd often hear accidental mentions of their stepfather and his children. They only mentioned arguments with their step-siblings, but I knew things couldn't be easy. I often tortured myself wondering how hard life might be for them in that household. I'd taken the red-eye back from New York and was resting in my easy chair, recovering from the trip, when the phone rang. The captain didn't waste any time. "Son, that bastard has put her in the hospital this time. He started hitting her right after you got him fired, and now she's hurt badly. You've got to get her out of there before he liquidates her. Even if it's not for Judy's sake, think about the twins. They shouldn't have to see their mother being used as a punching bag." A surge of panic hit me. "Where are the girls?" "Relax, they're safe. They were spending the night at their friend Laura's house, and I called your folks to pick them up. They took off with the girls on one of their trips, and we'll bring them back to you Sunday evening." Relieved, I said, "Why don't you come over and we can talk this through? This is the first I've heard of him beating her. Why would she even put up with it?" "You know why, don't pretend with me," he said. "We did everything to push her into that marriage. If she didn't realize you wanted to make her feel the pain she caused, she figured it out soon enough. She's so guilty over everything she did. She's probably willing to accept anything, even his misuse." I clenched my teeth. I could fool myself, but not the captain. "I never thought it would go this far. You knew he was no good. What did you think he'd do when he found out you were behind his firing and the maltreatment charges?" I swallowed hard. I guess because I'd never hit a woman, I just assumed he wouldn't either. "Come on over, Captain, and we'll figure this out. I promise." A long silence followed. Then the captain's voice became resolute. "This has to end. No one treats my daughter like that. Judy made me promise not to do anything drastic the last time, but I can't just sit here. This has to stop." "Captain, I really am sorry, for your sake. I never imagined it would lead to this. I'll be there in about an hour and a half. I'm stopping by the hospital first to see if I can convince Judy. Damn him, God damn him to hell." He hung up, and a chill went down my spine. It hadn't been profanity, but a real, raw curse. The captain was in his 60s and in poor health, but he'd never been the type to stand by when someone was being hurt. While I waited, I reflected on my latest attempt at revenge. When the divorce was final, I had spent days, even weeks, trying to come up with a way to get back at Capote, but I couldn't think of anything that wouldn't end up hurting me even more than it hurt him. I was in pretty good shape, but even though he was almost 20 years older, Capote was still near his college linebacker weight. Maybe I could get in a lucky punch, but even if he didn't press charges, I wasn't sure I could take him in a fight without years of martial arts training. Not that I had time for that. I checked Texas laws, realizing I couldn't file for alienation of affection, and Judy might have grounds for maltreatment, but I didn't. For a year and a half, my lack of revenge was like an irritating splinter I couldn't remove. Then fate gave me an unexpected opportunity. The CEO of Capote's company accidentally ran into me at a charity event. In Midland, no less, even though he lived in New York. Apparently, he'd heard I was winning an FLW award for public architecture and wanted me to design a large office building for them in Midland. I set up a meeting where I showed him a computer rendering of a design I'd been refining for years. Then I was honest with him. If it had been any other company, I would have been thrilled to build my dream design, but for them, I wouldn't do it at any price. Of course, in a company that size, the CEO had no idea who Capote was, much less my ex-wife. When I explained that I wouldn't work for a company that tolerated such behavior, he didn't react well. A few weeks later, Capote was fired for sexual maltreatment. The CEO later called to thank me, saying Capote had faced several maltreatment complaints over his 15 years there. Upon further investigation, he found enough recent incidents to justify firing him, and we signed a contract the next week. Professionally, I was on top of the world. But after the captain's call, I feared my personal life was about to hit a new low. When the captain arrived, more than an hour late, he rolled into the house without explanation. Before I could offer him coffee or anything else, he launched right in. "Son, she's in terrible shape. She'll be in the hospital for at least a week. Hell, they only kept me 3 days after a sextuple bypass." He was visibly shaking, the tremors stopping where his paralysis began, which only added to the pain of the moment. After a tense silence, he continued, still barely in control. "I can't let this go on. I supported everything you did because I thought she deserved some of it. But not this. You have to stop this." "Captain, how am I supposed to stop it? She's not my wife. I don't have any authority here. All she has to do is divorce him or press charges." The captain's voice held a commanding authority I hadn't heard before, and in that moment I understood how his junior officers must have felt when they made mistakes under his command. He snapped at me, refusing to accept my excuses, reminding me that he had been there, helping me through it all. He pointed out that I had known exactly what I was doing, intending for her to feel the pain of betrayal. Despite his love for me, he noted that I could be as cold-hearted as anyone he'd met, planning my actions without emotion, like a fighter-bomber pilot. He demanded to know, though, if I'd truly intended for things to end up this way. I nearly voiced a quick denial, but the look in his eyes stopped me. I lowered my head and admitted that, yes, I knew what I was doing. I knew that a man who cheated once wouldn't stop. Once a cheater, always a cheater. When I met his gaze again, I was surprised to find not anger or hardness, but a hint of compassion. Swallowing, I explained that I didn't think she'd stay with him. Midland was a small place, and I had made sure she'd know he was cheating, expecting she'd divorce him. The captain interrupted, asking if I'd been planning to take her back. I answered honestly, saying that while I had loved Judy, I couldn't live with someone who didn't love me or had chosen another. I might have been able to forgive her cheating, but not falling in love with him. I admitted that I'd used every angle I could, our daughters, even the captain himself, as well as her own morality, to push her into a marriage I believed wouldn't last 6 months. I wanted her to feel pain, though I hesitated, unable to say I hadn't intended for her to suffer this much. Part of me felt regret for the captain's sake, but I acknowledged that I didn't mind her being in a difficult situation. The captain held my gaze firmly, telling me he had tried to convince her to leave Capote at the hospital, but she wouldn't. He insisted that I was the only one who could truly make her leave, saying I had set this situation in motion, and I was the only one who could stop it. He asked if it was time I showed her some mercy. After a pause, he reflected that things hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. He had expected her to learn her lesson, repent, and return to me, humbled. He reminded me that he'd never seen anyone as devoted as I had been to her, and said he still believed that if she left Capote, I would take her back. Then he questioned why I thought she'd stopped loving me. I explained that when I had asked her that night, she replied, "I did love you." She had used the past tense, and that was the moment I realized there was no hope. It might not have been the answer he was looking for, but it was the only one I could give. The captain erupted, incredulous that all I'd taken from Judy's words was the tense of a single word. After a moment, he steadied himself, giving me a hard, evaluating look, and declared that I knew better. He said it was high time I realized what all this had done to her. His tone was sharp, but he managed to calm himself. Then, abruptly turning toward the door, he mentioned needing something from his car. With a commanding tone I hadn't heard before, he then ordered me to fetch the brown paper bag with books on the passenger seat. Though I don't usually respond well to orders, I followed through and brought him the bag. When I handed it over, he directed me to place it on the table, then asked if I knew Judy had kept a journal. Shaking my head, I indicated I hadn't. He continued, explaining that he hadn't known either until the hospital. He tried to convince her to divorce Capote, but she wouldn't listen. After calming down, he'd asked why Capote had beaten her, and Judy explained that Capote had seen her new journal and demanded she hand over the old ones. She had refused, clearly terrified of his reaction if he found them. When the captain offered to pick them up for safekeeping, she jumped at the idea, making him promise not to read them before she revealed where they were hidden. She even insisted he promise not to let anyone else read them either. He glanced toward his wheelchair and explained that, unable to reach her hiding spot himself, he took along a friend. Judy had written a note granting him permission, and he'd brought the son of a friend, a cop in uniform. Capote didn't give them any trouble, though the place was a mess. Kyle climbed up to the attic and returned with Judy's most recent journal, which she'd hidden inside a hollowed-out cookbook. Capote simply stood there, glaring, but did nothing else. The captain went on, saying that while he hadn't read the journals, and neither had Kyle, he hadn't promised not to give them to me, nor had I promised not to read them. He paused, giving me a long, intense look, and told me that he couldn't love me more if I were his own flesh and blood. Judy had her faults, he admitted, but lying wasn't one of them. He must have seen my reaction because he continued, acknowledging that not telling me about the affair was a form of lying, but insisted that, had I asked her directly, she would have confessed. Regardless, he pointed out, what was in those journals would be the raw, honest truth, her talking to herself. He urged me to read them and understand why she'd acted as she did, adding that we both knew it wasn't because she truly loved that man. Thoughtfully rubbing his chin, he finished by saying he couldn't make me forgive her. But he reminded me of the saying, to understand all is to forgive all. He suggested that perhaps if I learned more, I could, if not forgive, at least find some mercy for her. Then he added quietly, please. After the captain left, I sat staring at the sack of journals, but my thoughts lingered on his last words. He'd mentioned mercy twice, saying I held Judy at my mercy. I didn't like the thought, and I wasn't sure I fully understood it. Frustrated, I tried to rationalize what I'd done to Judy. I told myself I had only helped her make a moral choice to marry Capote, but I couldn't even finish the thought. Yes, it was her choice, and she was responsible, but I'd pushed her. I'd known I had power over her. Even as we divorced, I knew she wanted to atone for the pain she caused me, and I used that without hesitation. Kindness or forgiveness wasn't on my mind. I realized that. But who was I truly trying to punish? Judy or Capote? I'd ruined his career. No one would hire him for a management position with a 15-year gap and a record of repeated sexual maltreatment. He was working at a convenience store now, a long fall from a 6-figure salary. Yet, despite all that, I still didn't feel the score was settled. Part of me wanted him caught in a robbery, his life cut short. Then it hit me. My need for revenge would never feel satisfied as long as he still had Judy. Even if I didn't want her, he certainly didn't deserve her, especially now that he was misusing her. I wasn't inclined to ease Judy's pain, but the thought made me feel uncomfortable with myself, even a bit ashamed. I tried to recall anything else about mercy and remembered a phrase, the quality of mercy is not strained. Unsure of its meaning or origin, I looked it up and found this from The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. It didn't make me feel any better. I was still exhausted. It was just past noon, but to my body clock, it felt like the middle of the night. The air inside was hot, and outside it was scorching, typical for Midland in late July. I went to my room, sprawled across the bed, and fell into uneasy dreams that I didn't particularly want to face. When I woke, it was 4:30 a.m., and I found myself mumbling the phrase, to understand all is to forgive all. In the heavy pre-dawn darkness, I wondered if that saying held any truth. If I truly understood, would I forgive? And if I did, what would that forgiveness look like? Though I had sworn not to look at Judy's journals, I now felt an undeniable urge to find answers. Initially, I planned only to read what she'd written about the affair, but as I flipped through the pages, I noticed she rarely included the year and only occasionally the month, using just the day of the week. It was obvious she hadn't been writing for anyone else, not even for herself to reread. Instead, this was her way of making sense of her life's events. Once I began reading, I couldn't stop. Here was the heart and soul of the woman I'd loved more deeply than I thought possible. Though I hated what she'd done, I knew this was the essence of the person I'd have faced 100 dragons to protect. I picked up one of the journals, opened it, and began to read. It's done. The cavalry didn't come over the hill. The heroes didn't arrive just in time. Matt didn't stop the wedding. As I stood at the altar, my daughters crying in their little bridesmaid dresses, and heard the words, "Does anyone here have any reason?" Matt didn't burst in to save me. I said the vows, and this time, I won't break them. What a foolish fantasy. I didn't even realize I wanted to be rescued until this morning, so how could anyone else? Now, I'm truly trapped. I think the reality hit me around sunrise. There was no reason to think James would make love to me on our wedding night. He never had before. At least he finally stopped mocking Matt while he was with me. I hated that. Last night, I finally told him if he didn't quit, I'd start mentioning how much I missed Matt's larger size. I wish I'd said it sooner. When he finally wore himself out and started snoring, I escaped to the bathroom and cried for over an hour. Now James is out golfing. Who goes golfing alone on their honeymoon? The kind of man who insists I call him James. He doesn't want a nickname. No endearments. Just that cold, formal James. I swear I'll never do it again. Oh, Matt, Why did you make me marry him? But I know, don't I? I saw your face that Friday night, and a part of me died. Still, I kept hoping, praying you'd change your mind about this marriage that now feels like a prison. Would it have made any difference if I could have explained it to you? But how could I explain what I don't fully understand? How could I resist all those not-so-subtle hints that my job depended on keeping him happy? That obedience was mandatory when he ordered me to have a drink at his condo? Why did I try so hard to hide it from Matt? He would have put an end to it. He would have saved me. But in that last month, I wasn't sure I wanted saving, was I? Did I really start to love James? Or did I convince myself of that just to justify the betrayal of the man I did love? If I ever thought I loved him, he's killed it over these past 2 months, constantly boasting about winning me from a younger man, parading me around like a trophy. Oh my God, that's what I am. A 28-year-old trophy wife, his desperate attempt to feel young again as he nears 50. Oh God, what have I done? Who will rescue me now? As I kept reading, a few things gradually became clear. First, Judy had a subservient personality. Not exactly submissive, but she had a strong tendency to yield to anyone she perceived as powerful. She saw Capote as such a figure, and it seemed he had learned how to take advantage of this. Second, I had underestimated the depth of her pain over not having more children. She had feared I used my business as an excuse, and that stopping fertility treatments meant I'd given up for good. She felt crushed and resentful, a feeling I hadn't fully grasped. Her depression likely made her more vulnerable to someone like Capote. This didn't make her any less responsible for her choices. She had knowingly chosen to be with Capote, fully aware of what she risked by being with him. Her guilt was clear in her entries. She understood the weight of her actions and often wrote about her weakness. There were other surprises. She had figured out early on that I intended to punish her by pushing her into marrying Capote, realizing it after catching him cheating the first time. After reflection, she concluded that she deserved the punishment. Instead of complaining, she wrote pages about her pain. Not her own, but an intense awareness of how she had hurt me. After the first instance of his infidelity, she didn't dwell on it much. Though she disliked it and worried about diseases, she didn't care who he slept with. Then I came across entries that darkened the story. It was painful to read her stark descriptions of his misuse. Put too much sugar in his coffee. A hard punch to the stomach. I bruised my hip when I hit the floor. This had happened just 3 months after their wedding. She never made a big deal of it, accepting his beatings as deserved for her actions. What did break her was the thought of me with someone else. She wrote pages filled with regret and sorrow the first time she suspected I'd been with another woman. Ironically, she was wrong about that woman, though I had been with someone else by then. The combination of my latest relationship, Capote's misuse, and his pressures nearly pushed her to a breaking point. Capote's demands were twofold. He wanted her to go to a fertility clinic, with his parents willing to cover the costs, and he pressured her to engage in intimate acts she hadn't done with me. She made excuses, but in truth, she didn't want his child, nor did she want to do anything with him that she hadn't done with my husband, as she often referred to me, even years after the divorce. She rarely used any term of endearment for Capote. Closing the last journal, I felt exhausted. I returned to bed and slept. One advantage of running my own design firm was the freedom to set my hours however I liked. My staff knew not to contact me at home unless a building had collapsed. No one called during the next 2 days as I tried to sort through my thoughts. At the end of that time, I still hadn't made a decision. Capote was in serious trouble, though he didn't know it yet. I wasn't sure how I'd handle him, but his survival was questionable. I was seriously considering reaching out to people I knew who operated on the fringes of construction. They weren't allowed on my projects, but they had an appreciation for well-designed homes. My fee for designing a house had reached 7 figures. A deal, considering what some had sold for. A robbery gone wrong. Capote was an issue I could postpone, but Judy couldn't wait. She'd be out of the hospital in a few days, and while I was uncertain of what I wanted for or from her, I knew I couldn't let her return to that house. Even if I felt indifferent toward her, the thought of the twins under Capote's roof was terrifying. At least, that's what I tried convincing myself. Yet, whenever I considered taking action, images of Judy during her come-down time would flash through my mind, or worse, my nightmare from that Friday night, this time with Capote jeering at me as a partner. My mind was a constant loop of arguments. Every reason to show mercy found a counter-argument against it. Trying to escape the conflict, I turned on the TV news, only to see reports of another violent incident in the Middle East. Frustrated, I clenched my teeth and hung my head. Early on the 3rd morning, feeling determined but unclear about my purpose, I went to the hospital. When I arrived, she was still asleep. I stood beside her bed, observing her face, marked with deep bruises now fading to sickly shades of green and brown. I'd never seen anyone look so battered. Her cheekbone was cracked, but thankfully not broken. As I leaned closer to check the other side of her face, I didn't realize I was crying. I couldn't tell if it was a tear that fell on her or a muffled sob that woke her. Her eyes opened slowly, and she gave me a brief smile before realizing where she was. She let out a small gasp and pulled the sheet over her head. I told her we needed to talk, that I'd seen everything already, and talking through a sheet would feel ridiculous. She made a sound between a chuckle and a snort, but lowered the sheet. Though smiling, her eyes showed no light. She said that her dad had told her he'd given me her journals and that he had no right, though she was sorry it happened. Initially, she'd felt angry, but she'd realized she never wanted to hide anything from me. She admitted that if I had asked, she would have given them to me, and added that while she couldn't recall everything she'd written, she would appreciate it if I cleaned them up before letting the girls read them someday. I chuckled, remarking that I'd never let the girls see what she'd thought about our dating years. When I looked into her eyes, wide open and unguarded, I felt as though I had a window into her very soul. Seeing her vulnerable physically was one thing, but this level of exposure felt raw, almost overwhelming. She was letting me see a part of her that was profoundly personal, more exposed than any painful image I had of her with Capote. In a nearly whispered voice, she told me that she wished she could explain why she'd done it. She hadn't wanted to, truly hadn't, but she still had. She said she didn't blame me for divorcing her or for pushing her to marry James, admitting that she deserved it. However, she wanted me to know that she'd still do anything to make it hurt less for me. She paused, blew her nose, which came out as an awkward snort, then continued, looking a bit embarrassed. She admitted she couldn't even claim ignorance about the hurt she'd caused, thinking I'd catch her right after the first time. When things kept going, she'd felt confused. She never loved me any less, she confessed, but felt she'd wanted me to rescue her. And as strange as it seemed, she was hurt that I hadn't. She shared that she'd tried dropping hints with things like, "Mommy's come down time," and asked if I'd suspected anything before that night. I gritted my teeth and replied that I hadn't suspected anything. My trust in her had been absolute. I told her that if she'd claimed the sun was rising in the west, I would have called the McDonald Observatory to confirm, and I would have argued with them if they denied it. She took a slow, deep breath and admitted she never deserved that level of trust and couldn't have lived up to it. Then she paused, as if changing directions, and asked where we should go from here. I gave her a small smile, knowing she liked these sudden shifts in conversation, and told her she wouldn't be going back to his house, ever. She tilted her head, giving me a look like a teacher might give a slow student, and said realistically that she was married to him, for better or worse, though there had been more worse than she'd planned for. I felt my temper stir and insisted she wouldn't be going back, asking her to pretend I was rescuing her. I told her she was not going back. For a moment she looked confused, and asked if I'd read that in her journal, mentioning that she had sworn never to break her vows again. I interrupted, explaining that he had already broken every vow. They were his to keep, but he'd cheated on her and failed to love or cherish her. He'd ended the marriage, not her, and she was no longer bound to him. She blinked a few times, hesitating, so I warned her that if she ever went back to him, I would never let her see the girls again, as I couldn't risk their safety around him. At that, she broke down, burying her head in her hands, and as she cried, I held her close. She soon realized I was embracing her, and she clung to me, soaking my shirt with her tears. When she calmed down, she asked quietly where she would go and what she would do. I assured her that I would help and protect her from him, promising to have my lawyer prepare divorce papers and a restraining order. I asked if she'd sign them that afternoon, and without looking up, she nodded into my chest. Later that afternoon, my lawyer and 2 of his secretaries arrived at her hospital room, witnessing her signatures on the documents. Once everything was filed, he left us alone. She held my hand to her tear-streaked cheek, and, with her eyes glistening, asked softly if I would take her back when this was all over. It was the question I had feared. I recalled a thought I'd had while watching the news about war, that although war was cruel by nature, without mercy, it could never end. Mercy didn't imply surrender. It meant keeping one's humanity and making room for peace. This, I realized, was the time to show mercy to Judy, and I did my best. 5 years later, I sat in the waiting room on the maternity floor as Judy was moved from labor to delivery, preparing to give birth to twins. Boys, this time. Sitting next to a nervous first-time father, we chatted until a nurse announced Judy was ready. Mark shook my hand, thanking me for being there, and acknowledged the next few months would be challenging. I assured him, yes, and the girls are excited. I'll keep them at my place as much as possible, but I'll have my hands full too. Mark, a solid guy, an Army Reserve major and a captain in the Midland Fire Department, headed off to be with Judy. He'd earned a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts in service, and I admired him. He was a good match for Judy, and I was glad they'd found each other. Reflecting on Judy's question from 5 years ago, I'd tried to answer with mercy. When she'd asked if I'd take her back, I'd simply told her no, which brought her to tears. When she asked why, I explained as gently as possible that we weren't a match. I admitted that she'd always be my first love, but we both needed to make better choices. Together, as friends, we might even help each other. Mark suited Judy well, supporting her in a way I couldn't. She blossomed with him, and we had a supportive co-parenting relationship. The twins could bike between our houses, and if Mark and I disagreed, we'd turn to the captain for guidance, always keeping things smooth for the girls. Though they jokingly complained about too many parents, they adored Mark and were thrilled about new siblings. But I wasn't at the hospital for Mark or Judy. I was there for my wife and our newborn twin boys born the day before. Happily ever after? Perhaps. Mercy didn't mean avoiding consequences, but simply softening them. Taking Judy back wouldn't have been mercy. It would have been self-denial. I met my wife through a friend of Judy's, and she's the perfect match, keeping my ego in check and bringing joy to my life. If Judy hadn't cheated, we might still be married, but my happiness with my wife surpasses anything I had with Judy. Extending mercy to Capote was harder, but in the end, I decided his minimum wage job and the jail time he served were punishment enough. Though, when I heard about his new marriage to a naive woman, I shared my concern with a client whose friend worked in high-risk loans. The friend kindly sent someone to ensure Capote understood that good boys don't hit girls. I heard the lesson didn't need repeating. Having friends in low places has its perks. I still have much to learn about mercy, but withholding it only keeps you tied to the pain. When I finally showed Judy mercy, it allowed me to forgive myself too, breaking the steel shell around my heart and opening me to a new, happier life.